Welcome to Tech and Test, where we unravel the intricacies of technology, delve into the world of software engineering, and challenge the boundaries of software testing. Your host, Peter Johnson, will help you navigate the digital landscape, exploring the latest in tech, sharing insights into software development, and talking to the people that drive our digital world. Now, let's dive into today's episode.
And welcome to another episode of Tech and Test. And with me today is Luke Halpin. Hi, Luke.
Hiya.
Welcome to Tech and Test. And thank you for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
So, Luke, the reason I contacted you to come on the podcast is I quite like your interest in human-computer interaction and digital accessibility. So could you talk me through how just kind of share your journey with how you got into computer science and how you kind of started your journey in like computing?
Yeah, sure. So it kind of started back before I went to university. I was working at McDonald's and essentially just decided I'd had enough, wanted to go to university, but had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do career-wise, but knew I didn't want to be at McDonald's any longer. So my way of approaching that was computing is kind of everywhere now. If I choose to do a degree in that kind of area, regardless of what industry I want to go into, I'll have skills that could be useful. So I went to Lancaster, did a degree in software engineering, where I got involved in a lot of things around inclusion and equality and diversity, and also discovering that despite what it said on my personal statement applying how I found binary cool, I actually much prefer the higher level of computing about how we interact with technology rather than understanding how the magic box works. So yeah, I did my undergraduate degree from 2019 to 2022. At which point I started doing my PhD, which I'm still doing at the moment. And my research started as being around how we do academic assessment and trying to make it more accessible. But for anyone who's done PhD research, they'll probably be very familiar with you go in with one idea and it's not what you finish with. So that changed around a lot and is now where my current research is around how we design. It's around the design of coding environments and how they're not very accessible to students with ADHD when learning to program. And that's what I'm currently looking at the minute.
Awesome. I like how you've been so proactive and kind of, I'm not happy with my current situation, but there's something I can do about it myself and I can take some action and get some results. And I think that's really powerful, the journey you've gone through from from one situation, and you kind of are an example of how you can change your career if you want to, right? I think it just takes a lot of hard work. It's not easy to do a degree in computer science, right? And the higher degrees are even harder, especially when there's no, when you go into a non-taught program, when there aren't semesters with taught modules, it's a lot harder to figure out what you should be doing. And
Yeah, absolutely. No, going into the PhD was a really weird experience, if nothing else, because the structure of your undergrad is very almost procedural. You're being taught something, you're being given coursework on it, and eventually you'll do an exam on it. Whereas the first year of PhD is an almost surreal experience of, it somewhat depends on your supervisors, because I know some students who had similar structures of the supervisors would be setting them tasks saying, oh, I want to see this, I want to see that. But my supervisors were much more sort of letting me lead the direction. So from one day to another, I would be coming and going, what do I do today? Mm-hmm. Oh God, I need to decide what to do today. To the point the first year very much feels like, it feels like nothing happened. Mm-hmm. And as a result, second and the following years are all suddenly, I have to do the rest of my PhD now. But yeah, it's a very odd experience.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's and the thing is, it's also realigning. I guess you come out with some research questions of like where you want to go, And then as you get some data or you do some research, your opinion may change on that, right?
Yeah, figuring out research questions is actually a really tricky thing to do, to be honest. Like it's definitely the thing that's caused me the most difficulty over my time, because a lot of people will be able to say to you, "Oh no, that doesn't quite sound like a research question," but they won't really be able to say why or how it would sound better. It's like, because there's guidance and stuff, and people will say, "Oh, it should be this," but it varies a lot, especially depending on your very specific type of research. But they change a lot, again, as with everything else. Like how my topic changed, my questions change, depending on what exactly I'm finding, what exactly I'm doing as new literature comes out, and I'm finding out, oh, somebody's done this and found out this, which affects the work I'm doing. So nothing in your PhD is very static, but the research questions are something you need to keep in mind constantly, because regardless of whether or not they are guiding what you're doing, because there is certainly occasions where you will do some work and decide the research question that it answered slightly retroactively. But it's always still has to be a consideration at every stage. Like, you'll go into doing a study, for example, with some research questions, and then you might get to the end of it and go, it's not really answered this question, but it has answered a new question, or it's come from a different perspective. So stuff needs to change around. So I think one of the most important things for doing research is about flexibility, to the point that I actually got complimented recently not due to the work I'd done, or, well, partly due to the work I'd done, but not because of the quality of work, but because I'd had a panel, I'd received a lot of somewhat critical feedback on what I'd been doing. And then I came back to them and had taken it all on board, which is something that a lot of people find really difficult. I was told. I think they were mainly surprised by how willing I'd been to change everything. And it is a really important ability to be able to sort of take the personal out of it, listen to the feedback, and if necessary, change it a lot.
Wow. Yeah, that shows a lot of personal, like, behavioral traits, right, around resilience. Because, like, receiving feedback, I think it's not something, we need to be trained a little bit to handle feedback. Because I think, like, you can get feedback at work, or you can get feedback in code reviews, get feedback in many ways. But, like, when it's, you can take it personally, right? And I think it's nice to detach back. What kind of mechanisms have you used to kind of detach yourself personally from getting emotionally triggered by some of this feedback?
So I think it's largely linked into the type of feedback you get, because, as I'm sure you're aware, there's good and there's bad feedback. There's feedback that is just a criticism of what you've done, and there's feedback that's trying to help you improve.
Right.
I've been quite fortunate in my PhD that most of the feedback, when I've received it, it's been less about saying what I'm doing is wrong and more about saying, oh, have you considered this perspective, or there's a limitation on the way you're doing it. So, like with my topic, the reason it changed so much was because the scope was just too broad.
Right.
And the feedback wasn't that it was a bad topic or a bad idea. It was that it wasn't practical and it needed to be narrowed down in certain ways. So when feedback is useful, it's much easier to detach yourself, because I can interpret that as, it's not saying what I've done is bad. It's just saying it needs to change a bit. And it's less about what I've done so far being useless and more about it just how can I change it to still be useful, so it's not lost work and feeling negative. Because on the other hand, when you have just critical feedback, that is very difficult to detach yourself from. So I got some comments about, so my work is, as I said, is centered around ADHD, and I got some comments about, it seemed as though, oh, you've not talked about ADHD enough, or you haven't unpacked a good enough understanding of ADHD, which, as someone who has ADHD and has spent probably more time than I should have done for a computer science PhD trying to learn more about it, that kind of feedback is really hard to take and really hard to take on board, because you sit there with a professor across the table from you going, I know a lot about ADHD, actually. I just didn't quite put it in my slides. And
Yeah, I see.
critique that goes to something that's a bit more personal is always very difficult to turn off from. And I think the main way is it depends on your pre-established relationship with the person. If you know it's somebody who wants you to improve and wants you to succeed, you just have to keep that in mind and make sure you're finding the help in it rather than just finding the critique in it. But regardless of the dynamic, so say if it's someone you're less familiar with, you also need to just recognize which bits are useful. So there were some bits that would be things like, oh, I personally thought this wasn't very clear. And it's something to take on board, but it's not a core thing. It's a thing to keep in mind, but not a core critique of what you've done, because different people interpret things differently. I might say something in a way that I think makes sense, but be asked to, oh, could you explain it slightly differently? It happens a lot when I'm doing teaching work that I will be trying to explain a topic. And at the end of it, every time I finish explaining, I will always ask, has that made sense? Or has it sounded like I've just been rambling? Because I'm aware that is sometimes what it sounds like. And it's about working with the person.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's about building trust with the people that you're educating to, that I imagine, right? There's some like core fundamental human needs, and some of them are like trust and communication. And I think, I think it's nice. I think if you have good trust and communication with your supervisor and with your students, then you can kind of build up that rapport, which is quite cool.
Absolutely. And it's figuring out those communication styles. So I did an associate teacher program, finished about 6 months ago now, I think. And part of it involved doing a philosophy statement on for your like approach to teaching. And given I've shamelessly reused it for a coaching philosophy statement, which I've had to make recently, the main thing I focused on in it is recognizing that no matter how similar two people might be, the chances are they probably see the world very differently. And, pardon me, recognizing that in how you work together and how you communicate is an incredibly important thing. And that's incredibly fundamental in education, but also super important in the professional space. Recognizing that the people you're working with may not have the same background, the same understanding, the same perception as you, or be looking for the same things as you. Such as like when I'm working with students learning about programming and designing interfaces, when they're showing stuff to me, the questions I'm asking them about what aspects of it work, what aspects of it don't, are from my understanding. So someone might be presenting a system. So the software engineering students do a showcase at the end of each academic year on the group projects they're working on. And last year it was this year, sorry. They were doing autonomous systems to manage. It was managing a prison, which sounds really bleak, but it's just about it's a case study for something that you can have multiple facets to using microbits. And they had to design an interface, and they had a warning system for if there was an issue. And the way it worked is, if it was just there's something that needs looking at, it would be yellow. If there was a serious emergency, it would come up in red. And I got to ask them my absolute favorite thing to ask anyone who prefers back end to front end, which was, so it's just the only thing it tells you is the color. Yeah. Do you know what the most common form of color blindness is?
Yeah.
Which is red green, which makes everything look yellow. And it's not to say they've not done a good job. They had, but it's recognizing the different perspectives.
Yeah.
Will have different things, and communicating those fairly and in a considerate way. So, like, I would never just say to them, "Oh, you're awful. You're being really inaccessible, and I'm going to let you figure out why."
Yeah.
It's being friendly with it, making sure you're not trying to make people feel like, "Oh, it's awful." It's just like, this is something extra you can consider. which is partly because had sort of been chatting to them and I'd figured out, sort of tried to gauge the kind of communication style they were comfortable with. Whereas some people, I know when I've given the feedback, prefer a much blunter, just almost a bullet point list. And I think figuring out the kind of feedback that each individual finds most useful and vice versa, communicating which style you find most useful is a really important skill.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really strong transferable skill into the workplace, right? Because something I've noticed is when I deal with different individuals in the workplace, you can tell from the communication style. Like sometimes you may get an email to say, please give me this data by the end of the week, right? And someone may read that and take that personally and go, oh, that's not nice. But actually, if you sort of break it apart, it's a communication thing. Maybe this person values data and they just want to see the data, right? And that's kind of, and I've actually spoken to some program managers who have this communication style. And when they actually send those emails out, there's no implication on trying to be personal with them. It's just, they just want the data. That's what's key and important to them. So I think, and then someone else may fluff it up and go, call to action. It would be very nice if everyone could, put together some data for, and then it's really long-winded and you're not really clear what the action is, right?
Yeah, I know when it comes to email, I think I definitely fall into the latter. I really enjoy writing an email where I'm like trying to balance everything, trying to make sure everything's included, but it's also being friendly and all that. Like I enjoy email a little bit too much. But it's also because it's a really interesting form of communication. Well, most text-based is, but email, I think, because it has an air of formality to it, is extra interesting because I find emails always come with a sort of implied tone of officialness. Like there's a level of seriousness to them. Like if someone drops you a team message or WhatsApp or anything like that, it's a bit more casual. When it's an email, that's like, oh, this is official. It's got this air of the communication with authority. And I think that means when you lose in written communication, the arm flapping that isn't coming up because it's just slightly below the screen here, but also the tone of voice, your facial expressions, when you lose so much of the things that you don't realize are key parts of communication, and it's an email, you're just left with that sense of what you get with an email of it's an official communication, it's very short and curt, and you just kind of default assume, oh, that's them saying, I need the data now, to use your example.
Yeah.
And it's a difficult thing to balance because there will be days where you just need to send a quick email. But equally, it's a very interesting area. And there is research about it, though I have never had a chance to look into it properly. It's just I've had conversations with people about it. Because even little things, like I updated my email signature recently because I was talking to a friend who mentioned how apparently putting thank you at the bottom of your email increases like people reading the full email and responding. Because the example they gave is they run a scouts group, and they said when they'd been trying to communicate with parents via text, via in person, via letters, no matter what, they couldn't get a reply. And then they mentioned it to their dad, who's worked in IT industry for a while, and the dad just mentioned, just put thank you at the end. Did that, suddenly everyone was replying, and it's this documented phenomenon apparently, and it's just little things like that, which are why like email and like written communication are just so interesting because they have so many unwritten rules, and so many of them are very difficult to account for or even try and work your way around, let alone understand.
You raise a lot of interesting points there. I think that's why sometimes I go into the office more than I should, because it means I have so many conversations with people coming to my desk, in the coffee machine, and there's so much communication that verbally we're not saying maybe a lot of information, but I'm reading a lot of body language, reading tone of communication. And I think that those things can actually be, there's a lot of communication that's happening, right, that is not actually being said. And I think you don't pick up those cues when you just do online communication.
No, yeah. And there's other benefits to in-person communication, because when it's being typed out, you feel a need to not drag it out too much. Like I have a bad habit of I will put 4 questions in an email and then get frustrated when I only get a response to the last one.
Yeah.
But when you're speaking, it's much easier to do the sort of like the tangents in your conversation. So like my favorite thing is talking to people about research, and just realize as I'm talking, because I do rubber ducking in every stage in my life. I'll be just talking and I'll realize, oh wait, I need to write this down there. And it's something you can't really get in written communication. It's not quite the same process.
Yeah. No, I also think sometimes, I'm being very honest, sometimes I use ChatGPT to create emails for me because I'm so busy, and I get some text and I modify it to make sure I'm happy with it. But you can see the urgency here that, the fact I'm happy to use like a large language model to write the email for me means I'm not putting a lot of energy in those emails, and I'm not always getting what I want across, like emotionally. I just want, okay, write me an email that's going to ask for this data and, set up a meeting at this time and, send that off. And I think in one way we're sort of taking away the human element from communication.
In some ways, yes, but equally, it's because there's a lot of aspects of communication that are standard anyway. Some bits that you wouldn't be able to differentiate with the AI or the human. And I think those little tweaks, those little specifications are what make it a more human communication. And it's also depending on, like, because some things don't need a lot of emotion. Like you say, because asking for a response on something, it's not something that needs to be incredibly considerate. Depending on the context, of course.
Yeah.
But then there's also using AI as a tool is something I think is quite important. Like, ensuring it's used in the correct ways. Like, it comes up in academia a lot at the minute with people worried about people using AI for coursework and stuff like that. And I think it's a tricky thing to balance, using something as a tool and using something as a crutch. But then there's also the worry that AI is going to make everything redundant in terms of human working. Though I think BCS have been doing, it keeps popping up on my feed recently. They keep posting something saying, it's something along the lines of, AI isn't going to steal your job, but somebody using AI will, which I think is quite an interesting way to look at it. And it's not viewing AI as this evil thing that's going to take over the world. It's using it as this tool that needs to be tapped into. But then there's also the considerations around, like, what's the word? Completely forgotten the word. Environmental friendliness,
Right.
to do with energy of it, seeing how energy efficient it is for certain tasks. There's some things you need AI, so like large language models, analyzing huge quantities of data. But then there's some things where some people might say, so for example, writing an email in some situations might be an unnecessary use, depending on the balance of almost the time it's saving to the energy it's using. And it's the kind of thing that, like, the energy aspect of it is something I often don't really see come up in discussions online. Like, the media always covers the AI is taking our jobs, but never anything to do with the amount of energy it uses.
Right.
Like, there was a moment when I was home recently, a family do, and some family members had this thing where it was using AI or something to put your face on a footballer. And they were asking me, hey, do you want to do it? I was like, no, because I'm unfortunately aware of how bad that is for the environment.
Yeah.
I want no part of it. But it's the kind of stuff that's not really talked about.
Yeah, I think that you raised a lot of topics there, right? I mean, if you look at India at the moment, there's a lot of like heat waves that potentially could displace a lot of people globally, right? If that continues. And I think we do need to think about compute and actually even programming languages, right? If you use Python, I think it comes up on my feed a lot, where Python is one of the worst languages for like power efficiency, right? In terms of,
Absolutely.
So, but Python's used a lot in data analysis, AI models, and everywhere.
Yeah, because it's designed quite well in terms of it has a lot of functions to it. It has a lot of libraries and things that can make it quite useful for pardon me, stuff like that where you're working with data rather than almost using it as a raw programming language to develop a program. And it is interesting because I will disclose I'll be very biased here because I personally hate Python.
Nice.
I hate programming in Python. I don't like it. Most of the time I try and characterize myself as like, oh, computer scientist, human computing. But complaining about Python is one of the few times when I'm talking to students where I'll say, well, as a software engineering graduate, because I just have an unjustified hatred of it. But then there are occasions where it helps me by justifying that hatred with things like its energy efficiency, and that aspect of it. In fact, I'm pretty sure my first ever programming lecture, because the two lecturers who were giving it also don't like Python, was them having a 2 to 5 minute rant saying C is the best programming language because, like, if I do this task in C, do you want to know how long it takes? It takes this long. If I do it in Python, do you want to know how long it takes? It's 10 times as long, or something like that. But yeah, it is interesting because regardless of how much I dislike it, I'm unable to say it's not useful because it has so many things incorporated into it to make it useful for like data science and all that analytics side. And it's quite often used in things like AI and large language models. The friend I mentioned earlier who it works primarily in Python since starting their PhD because they're working with large language models. And yeah, it was amusing when they started out because now they're quite fond of it, but the amount of complaining they did saying, we're in Python, yeah. But again, no matter how much we don't like it, we can't deny at the moment that there isn't an alternative that has all the same functionality within it. Though when there is, my God, I'm advocating for it.
Yeah. So, I mean, what kind of languages do you use or recommend?
So I am most familiar with Java just because that's the one that I used most during my undergrad. And it's quite a common one in education and learning.
Yeah.
I am at some point going to have to teach myself Python for some of the studies I want to run involving learning how to program because Python is a very human readable language. Java is in some ways compared to stuff like C, but still is a programming language. But yeah, my main familiarities are probably C and Java, just because those are the ones I've got experience with, and I do like them. I like C for the fact that there's no messing about. You know what you're doing with C, but make sure you're not doing something wrong with C, because it will also tell you and break your computer. And then with Java, it's similar. You've got a fair amount of freedom to do what you want in some respects, but it's also got that little bit more useful functionality so you're not having to do everything on your own. So yeah, I have a soft spot for Java. It's the one that I've probably used the most and have the most familiarity with.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, what I'm seeing now with Python is it's a lot more ubiquitous in terms of more people using it. They've even, like, my son's 5 years old, right? And I can imagine within like a couple of years that there's going to be an initiative to get like these like 7-year-olds trying to do coding in Python, right? If it's not already happening.
Yeah, because I think the one that happens most at the moment is trying to introduce concepts of programming with block languages. So, as I mentioned earlier, Microbit. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I've played around with it maybe once or twice. I think it's like the new BBC.
The BBC Microbit, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. It does. I think it's only mainly used in education circles, right?
So I'm actually quite lucky in the sense that the Lancaster was one of the people involved in creating Microbit. It's
nice.
One of our professors, Joe Finney, I think he wrote most of, if not all, the firmware for it, for how it actually runs. To the point that when we had to use it in some coursework, a few of us went to try and get inside information from him, only to find out that the lecturer running that module had thought ahead and told him he was to say nothing. Nice. But yeah, it's a really interesting little device. It obviously has the Microbit service where you can use block programming to create functions and do quite a lot with it. Because, like I mentioned, with the software engineering students, they use microbits for developing mock autonomous systems, but there's actually quite a lot you can do with them in terms of the functionalities of their radio signals, the location tracking, and stuff like that. It is quite interesting how much you can actually do with them. And they are very useful for learning because it's not just the ability to do a block showing, oh, because this is within that block, it does it for this length of time. It's being able to see this physical thing that is reacting. And I think that is, for me, block programming is always going to make sense as for like the very young age groups, the introduction to programming. But translating that to Python works really well in terms of, because it is just human language. It is just basic English, more or less, without the syntax and all the extra rules, which I personally like because it makes it look neat. And it's a very useful progression tool. Hence why I'm probably going to have to learn it properly. Like, I know it a bit, but I'm going to have to learn it properly for a study I'm hoping to conduct later down the line, which involves teaching people to program.
I see. Yeah, no, it's definitely a tool, I think, that like, there's also the Raspberry Pi, right? I don't know, like, how much benefit you get with, like, the Pi versus the microbit. I don't know which one trumps the other in which, like, educational scenario, but...
Yeah, I can't say I have any experience using the Raspberry Pi. It's something that I've constantly been like, if I'd sort of come across one, I'd have played around with it and figured it out. But I've never had the opportunity, and I've never had a good enough reason beyond just wanting to tinker with one to get one. There's always been something else on my list, say, of things that I need to spend a bit of money on. I think Raspberry Pis tend to be, I'm definitely going to get corrected on this, but I feel like they're a bit more bare bones in terms of you have to do a lot more of it yourself depending on what functionality they have in them. Whereas Microbit has a lot of functions and stuff within it, and it's very much designed with the intent of being that educational tool, because it was a collaboration between Microsoft, BBC, Lancaster, and a couple of other organizations. And it was created with the intent of bringing education to around computer science to students who hadn't had an opportunity before. I was at a workshop they did where they were talking a few months ago, and they mentioned, I can't remember the stat they said, but it was apparently so many million children had used a microbit since the start of their project. And it was this really interesting achievement about how they were bringing computer science education to more and more people and getting them interested in not just computer science, but STEM in general, in terms of that procedural thought process and understanding what technology can do in society.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, so I guess it's, designed with education in mind from the beginning, where Raspberry Pi, I think it's a lot more generic, right? You can add these different GPIO boards, or you could use it as a media server, right? It's very...
it's more designed to be a jack of all trades, whereas Microbit is designed with the core intent of it being an educational tool that happens to also be able to do a few other things. It does quite well, but it is largely aimed at that process of it's meant to be used with block language for teaching people how to do things.
Awesome. So Luke, can I ask you, like, what motivate, like, who inspired, is there anyone that inspired you to kind of, or inspires you even today now, right, to do the research you're doing?
Does anyone inspire me?
Or who inspires you in general to do computing?
It's tricky to say. I think it's less that I find inspiration in an individual, more in sort of like groups and how things have progressed. So, like, the thing that initially got me into computer science and finding an interesting topic was just the sheer scale of it. So I was talking to someone recently, and I just sort of said, I was about to take credit for someone else there. A student was doing a presentation, and I was talking to someone else about it later. And their presentation was about the way computer science and computing in general has become integrated into society.
Right.
And it was an interesting observation they made that no other sort of like technological advancement to the same extent as computing, no other advancement has become as core a part of society as computing technology has. So like you could look at cars, other technological advancements, but I've suddenly forgotten the list of it. All of them have had significant impact, but nothing else has become as integrated into society. Like even this conversation is facilitated by computing over a network. The clock over there is run by the internet. So many things are dependent and essential with computing. And it's both terrifying and also inspiring to see the level of creativity that we have used to change the world so rapidly as well. Like when you look back at what technology was like 100 years ago, there wasn't really the sort of first programmable computer hadn't been made because that was Alan Turing. And well, I believe it was Alan Turing. I shouldn't say that because I know there's a lot of computing history that isn't talked about as much. So I don't want to incorrectly say something that I will get told off by one of my friends who's very a history student who knows a lot about like the women's history and computing, which is sadly not talked about enough, such as little things like have you ever seen the film Hidden Figures?
No, I haven't. Probably
so
should.
It's insight. It's a good film if nothing else, but it is also really interesting because it's about how the women who are involved in the space program, NASA space program, and it's a lot of them were sort of pioneers in computing, and it's the kind of stuff that's not talked about in history as much. Like the main name that gets thrown about is Alan Turing, but then there's also stuff like Ada Lovelace, who I don't know. I desperately want to learn more about, but never find the time to do so.
It's a good point. But I don't know if computer science like degrees cover some of the history, really.
Not to my knowledge. So we'll sometimes talk about the progression of technology, but we rarely talk about the people involved in it, which I suppose makes sense because it's not really computer science. It is more history. But I think it is always really interesting to talk about that a lot of the pioneers in computing were women. But if you turn up to a computer science lecture theatre, you will not see that many women. It is like there's a really ironic occurrence we have in our department where a lot of our student ambassadors, so I'm a student ambassador for my department, and we also have a lot of women who are student ambassadors. And it's always really funny to see, because parents will ask like, most of them are, is that, so do you have a high percentage of women in this course? I'm like, no, it's just they all seem to want to be student ambassadors, which is great because they are making it feel more accessible to women. And it's something that is sorely needed.
Yeah, I guess this is kind of what I'm going with, who influenced you. I guess if you see someone that influences you and can kind of make you more motivated to take a certain path.
And I think that's kind of similar to, because when I say there isn't really a single particular person who's inspired me, because there was quite often not a lot of people like me in sort of positions to inspire. So the way I would describe myself as a child was slightly odd individual who didn't really fit in. Eventually figured out I was gay and I'm autistic, have ADHD, a few different labels. And I often found that there wasn't a lot of people like me. And it's something I almost wanted to change. So like whenever I'm on campus and stuff, I will be wearing my rainbow lanyard and stuff like that, because I want people to see a visible person who might be like them. And because the problem is, it's a lot better now than it was. So like whenever I'm on LinkedIn, and this might just be because the people I follow, but I'm bombarded by really incredible people who are like me in terms of being neurodivergent. They might be queer. They're women who are succeeding in their chosen fields, and it's gotten a lot more inspiring than it used to be. But I think that lack of anyone like me and that sort of feeling like I was not in a position to succeed,
right,
is kind of what inspired me a little bit.
Yeah, I see. I mean, I guess, you are starting a momentum that maybe you could motivate other people, right? Like you may have had it harder when you were growing up, and maybe hopefully now it's easier for other folks to see you now as an inspiring figure. And
yeah, like one of the things I kind of want to do at some point once I've passed my PhD is I would love to be able to go back to my school and sort of like give an assembly on saying, hey, I don't care how weird they're all calling you. They have to call me doctor now. You can do it. And that is, obviously I have other motivations, but that's a lovely little one that I do keep in the back of my mind sometimes on days where I just need cheering up a bit.
Sure. Yeah, there's I can imagine doing a PhD is a very lonely process as well, right? There's a lot of time you spend by yourself researching.
It's very lonely in the sense that, because it is, for the vast majority of it, of course, independent work, so you're doing it on your own. But it's also, I think for me especially, the thing that's loneliest about it is you will have supervisors who are picked because they are in similar fields to you. Whereas my supervisors I have because they are kind of each have different aspects of what I do.
Right.
So my research is about inclusive technology and learning. So I have a supervisor from educational research who does stuff about supporting students with disabilities. I have a supervisor from computer science who's about technology enhanced learning. And I also have another supervisor in computer science who, well, she's on maternity leave at the moment, but she works in sort of like understanding how, like ethical software engineering, stuff like that. And but none of them really quite often understand what it is I want to get out of this research. So I'll constantly have conversations where they'll be saying, oh yeah, because we wanted to find this, aren't we? And it's like, no. And there was an interesting thing that helped me sort of realize it was I was writing a plan for a study at one point, and I was asking for some feedback because I'd put somewhere in it, say, oh, I will consult other experts, and said, you shouldn't write that, because the point of a PhD is you will be the expert in your PhD, which is a really fun thing to be able to say. You should, in theory, be a world-leading expert in your very specific topic. But by nature, it also means nobody around you really understands or is doing your topic. So it's
Right.
not just that fact that you can have days where you're kind of just in the office all day on your own. It's also the fact that nobody is really doing the same stuff. You're isolated physically and intellectually in terms of, like, because I really want to look at how we're designing stuff and being inclusive, but then one supervisor will be sort of more interested in the learning perspective, another will be more interested in the software engineering perspective. And it does just make you realize that the loneliness is not just physical, it is mental as well.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. You can't just research another paper and, find a paper and go, yep. You need to be very specific and take a little bit out of that, then apply it to your research area, right?
Yeah, like I'm constantly looking through papers to also to almost cannibalize them for things, but from looking for papers that have done a slightly similar method to what I'm doing, so I can cite them and saying, oh, I'm doing it this way because these people did it this way and it all turned out fine, to I'll be looking for papers that have a very specific finding where I'll be like, oh, this is a really interesting paper. However, I only care about this bit. And it's quite fun. It does sometimes feel like a little scavenger hunt. But yeah, it is again just sort of emphasizing, especially in my research to do with ADHD, where I'm trying to look at it from because a lot of research around ADHD is very rooted in the existing diagnostic criteria, which I and a lot of other people in the disability community do not like. because it is heavily based on studies from years and years ago that were exclusively young white boys. So a lot of cultural considerations aren't made by it. A lot of considerations for adults aren't made by it. A lot of considerations for women aren't made by it. And it gets to the point where every time I'm reading a paper, its first reference for ADHD will be the DSM criteria. Right. And it'll just make me a little bit annoyed. I'll just be like, there's better references than that. Because there have been people who've done good research. I specifically have a favorite paper from 1997, which is because even back then, it was a paper critiquing the diagnostic criteria at the time, which hasn't changed enough since 1997. But yeah, it's something that will make you feel isolated, that you're trying to look at it from this different perspective, but a lot of the research is just sort of rooted in this other stuff. And it's quite disheartening at times, but it also means that when you do come across a good source, it's this really exciting feeling. Like I had attended a seminar by Kata Spiel a week or two ago, who is a researcher currently working in Vienna, I believe. And they work in digital access affordances and do a lot of work with neurodivergence and non-binary users. And listening to them talk about the topic was just so exciting. It was this person who was looking at everything from an inclusive perspective. And they also did this really sort of thing that I found quite clever at the beginning, where they started it by introducing themselves in sign. So they weren't speaking, they were just signing an introduction. And so I don't know sign language. It's on my list of things, my very, very long list of things of stuff I want to do or learn at some point. And that was the purpose. It was for an audience of people who are potentially used to not experience access impairments to understand what it's like to not be able to engage in content. So we're so used to being able to hear and see things, but when you're in a position of, I don't understand what's happening, I can't access this. And it was just a really clever little way of giving you a sense of a barrier that you may not have experienced before going on to talk about why access affordances and digital accessibility are so important, but not just important for the sake of doing them, but for the sake of them being meaningful. So they were talking a lot about the different types of accessibility considerations, the different models of disability. And it was really interesting talk, and absolutely, I loved it.
It's a good point. I actually quite liked Coldplay. I think the recent, saying a lot about me maybe, but the last record they done, the music video for it, it feels like I'm falling in love. I think that's their last single they got out. They done the whole video in sign, and so I think that was pretty cool. And sort of hat tips to potentially some of the 1.3 billion people that are disabled on the planet, right? It's sort of little hat tip to some of those people who are deaf and can't experience their concerts maybe in the same way. So I thought that was quite nice.
Yeah, it's always interesting and kind of heartwarming to see people making those considerations, because little things like that, or little things like if you're attending an event and they have a quiet space, if you experience sensory overload, it's not just making it easier to access, it's making you feel valued and like people want you to be there. Because accessibility isn't just a logistical consideration. It's an acknowledgement that not everyone is the same. Like I had to talk about crip theory recently, which is an academic theory around how a lot of society and everything is structured on the assumption. So it's also got a bit of queer theory in it, but it's based on the assumption that everyone is able-bodied and everyone is heterosexual. And the crip theory talks a lot about challenging that. And when we have little access accommodations like Coldplay doing an album in sign language, or people having quiet spaces, or having subtitles on a video, that does the job of not just making it so someone can access it, but helping them have a little bit of time where they're not in a world that assumes everybody is a carbon copy and everyone can do the same things.
Yeah, 100% on that one. And it's nice to see when organizations do make the effort. I recognize it, and I think as you get older, there's more chance of disability for everyone, right? Not just disabilities we're born with, but disabilities of aging just gives you disability. So I think we're all disabled in some way, and we will be more disabled as we get older. So I think
one of my friends' favorite quotes when they're getting annoyed at people who aren't being accessible or aren't considering disability needs is, if you live long enough, at some point you will be disabled, because even if it's just the social disability of you reach a point where you're not able to keep up with everything. Because when you're talking about access considerations, you also have to keep in mind people who are of different generations and haven't been able to keep up with the rapid advance of technology. And at some point that becomes disabling, because everything is now digital and online.
Yeah.
Some things exclusively so. And for people who struggle to engage with that technology, it's now an accessibility consideration. Because something I find really interesting is considering digital accessibility not just something to accommodate disability or make something more inclusive. There is, as it's becoming, as I've mentioned again, part of every aspect of life, digital accessibility needs to not just be the digital equivalent of ramps for a wheelchair. Right. It is making sure everyone can authentically engage with something. So non-binary user can use the correct pronouns. Somebody who doesn't have a standard European first name, last name can accurately enter their name into a form. Or somebody who doesn't understand the way technology is working at the moment can still find a way to engage with it and figure it out and use it. And that's something I think is really important to think of when you think about digital accessibility, because it's not just making your tech screen reader friendly, it's making it usable and engageable for everyone, even though that is often a very difficult task and involves a lot of communicating with a lot of people about their needs, but also, to hark back to the flexibility in receiving feedback, it's about willingness to listen when someone says something isn't working for them.
Yeah, I totally agree with that one. I think sometimes, I think we called it web accessibility or digital accessibility, right? I think web is sort of got into the web content accessibility guidelines, right? So that there's a lot of like guidelines which are very focused on web, and they've sort of maybe crept into like legislation, but like, it's a valid point. I think we don't talk about it enough. And I think from a lot of organizations' perspective, maybe they just see it as like a compliance effort where they need to adhere to some standards and tick the box and say, yep, we've got accessibility. And it's an interesting space. Like, there's a lot of guidelines that are put out there, but who makes these guidelines? There's only a few organizations which probably contribute to them. Are they actually the standard we're setting? Are they actually correct guidelines? Right? Do they bring inclusiveness for everyone? Right? Because there's some intrinsic bias in those guidelines and the organizations and people that make them. I know there's web content accessibility guideline 3. I think that's still in draft, or it's close to being released. But maybe that changes things up. I've not looked at it, but it's definitely an interesting space. But,
absolutely.
But thanks, Luke. Thanks for coming on the podcast. We've reached that time. I could talk for another hour, but I really appreciate you. Is there anything you want to kind of like say to the audience on your way out?
I guess just thanks for listening. I think if there is any message to be taken away from my admittedly very wide topics in terms of rambling, it's communication is a key thing to keep in mind with accessibility considerations, because no one person will ever be able to understand the experiences of everybody else, but everybody else is usually happy to tell you what their experiences is if you give them the opportunity to do so.
Yeah. And with that, I think I'm gonna say goodbye to everyone. I think I want to leave that comment there for everyone to ponder on. So thank you, Luke. Really appreciate your time today on Tech and Test.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Hello, it's Peter. Thank you for listening to this episode of Tech and Test. I personally appreciate it, and I hope you got something out of it too. If you're interested in subscribing, please do, because then you don't miss any episode I've created. And you can also visit techandtest.co.uk, which has all the episodes that I've created. And you can visit peterintest.com for my personal blog too. So I'll see you on the next episode.